Chapter 49. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps my motivation to continue writing this story. Warning, some of the content in the following chapter may be triggering for some of you. It will explore the themes behind sexual assault, though it does not happen. I repeat, it does not happen. Please proceed with caution. Chapter 49. It was the sound of the dripping water that first made its presence in reality known to her senses. It was such a damp atmosphere, wherever she was, that the feeling of wet perspiration clung to her skin and clothing. But it was also cold, so the saturation sent an ever-revolving amount of shivers to propel through her body as her teeth endlessly chattered, fighting for any semblance of warmth. On her tongue, there was the metallic taste of iron and lead, almost as though she had bitten it hard enough for it to bleed and swell within her mouth. It was also dark. There was a piece of cloth tied over her eyes, the knot of it pressing tight against the aching bump at the back of her head. With a groan, she rolled her head upward from where her chin had previously been resting against her chest. Her neck straining against the movement from being bowed over for far too long. What was going on? Where was she? Who is she? She couldn't remember anything except. A gasp escaped from deep within her chest as it all came flooding back, her life growing up in Brooklyn. Soccer practice when she was 7. A gift from her father of a trip to Coney Island, just the two of them. A budding love for the theater. Her first play as Cinderella. Her mother as she brushed the hair off her forehead tenderly. A delicate kiss goodnight when they thought that she was sleeping. Her father, turning to alcohol and gambling away all they had after he got laid off from his job. The fights. Endless screaming. The noise too much. The constant begging for her to go and visit Aunt Anna in Queens. Aunt Anna finally gifting her with her very own copy of a key to her apartment. Her first boyfriend. After begging her for years to go out with him, she finally relented. Only for him to cheat on her because she wouldn't put out at 15 years old, and he decided to try his luck with Gwen as well. Escaping her house after a really nasty fight between her parents. Finding Spider-Man sprawled out, unconscious in an alleyway in front of a blazing building. Helping Spider-Man when he wasn't aware of who he was. And falling for him in the process. Meeting Tony Stark. Spending weeks afterward pining after Spider-Man. The slap her dad inflicted on her cheek while he was in the midst of a drunken binge. The result of which had her running to Queens to go see Aunt Anna. The fight with Sandman. Spider-Man finally showing up in that ridiculous homemade suit of his. All that talk about fate. Seeing an attractive boy's face through an open doorway as she told him that he'd just hit the jackpot, not yet knowing how backward she had that assertion at the time. Learning that boy's name, Peter Parker. A new gasp escaped her as his name flooded through her thoughts, accompanying with it were all of the memories of their shared history together. All of the gentle smiles, shared laughter, teasing, his handsome face. The comfort that he always seemed capable of providing to her. How he made her feel safe and protected because Peter. He was Spider-Man, wasn't he? Yes. He was Spider-Man. And she had fallen desperately for him. Both sides of him. A scuffle resounded a short distance away and Mary Jane recoiled at the noise, snapping back to reality. Where the hell was she? Is she awake yet? A muffled voice sounded as though it were coming from the other side of a thick door. At that exact same moment, she remembered her modeling world tour. And how she had been attacked upon arrival in Venice as soon as her driver had pulled into a concealed garage. Eyes widening underneath the blindfold, Mary Jane forced her head to fall forward, feigning unconsciousness just as the sound of a door creaking open met her ears. Panic clawed up her throat, threatening to make her sick from the amount of stomach acid she could suddenly taste in her mouth. But somehow, she resisted the urge. She tried her best to stay as still as possible. It was like playing a role on the stage, right? She was nothing more than a simple statue. Oh, or a column of ice. It was only then that she realized that her hands and feet were bound to a chair. She had no hope of moving anywhere even if she tried. Footsteps clapped down onto the hard, cement floor as they entered the room, at least 3 sets of heavy pairs judging off the sound. They all stopped in a semicircle around her prone form. Still out like a light, one deep voice confirmed, thick in its Italian accent. The distinct smell of cigar smoke followed and she knew that he was smoking right then. Strange that she came back unconscious, an American accent responded, his tone musing and sparked with fascination, making her feel like a zoo animal on display in a cage. Perhaps that was just all that she was to them. Something to point and gawk at. He stepped forward then to place something metal directly underneath the platform of her chair. A bucket? A jolt shot through her as she realized what it was meant for. She was still wearing her long skirt from when she had changed into it in the hotel in Rome. And it was currently flowed out across the edges of the seat she was on. An even further realization hit her when she noticed that there was a small hole in the actual seat itself. They weren't even going to let her go to use the bathroom? There's a lot of strange things that's been going on, another Italian voice continued as the American man stepped back from her form, completely unaware of her inner turmoil. The girl coming back unconscious is the least of it. Have we finally figured out what happened? Her tumultuous thoughts halted. She needed to hear the response to this as well. There were so many unanswered questions brewing through her mind. The news has been a shitstorm, the American man responded, but it had something to do with the Avengers. You were right, Paolo, it's been quite a bit of time since the dusting happened. Or should I say, the blip? According to the news, it's been over 5 years. Freezing, Mary Jane almost slipped up by nearly releasing a gasp at this proclamation. Her near mistake would have tipped them onto the fact that she was, in actuality, very much awake. But 5 years? Her memory was swarmed by images of what had happened just before she was hit over the back of the head, the bizarre event that she had witnessed. Where some of the men that had been attempting to capture her had suddenly combusted into a pile of dust. Was she after she passed out? Had she been one of them, then? Had she also turned to dust? If so, then how was she back? Shouldn't she, along with these men, be dead right now? The one American man had mentioned the Avengers, but even with adding them into the equation, it still didn't correlate in her mind. Because if it really had been 5 years, how had the Avengers gained the ability to resurrect the dead? So what happens with the girl, then? Her thoughts cut off again as she waited on bated breath. They weren't going to kill her, were they? If they intended on doing so, then why did they wait? Why didn't they just finish the job when they first realized that she was still unconscious? That would have been more merciful, with her being none the wiser. She would have preferred it that way if death was meant to be her fate. Then at least there was a chance that she wouldn't feel any pain. We called Tombstone. To renegotiate, a bit of tension left her shoulders, so slow, that they couldn't have possibly noticed the movement. We didn't sign up for this shit. It was supposed to be a simple kidnapping and interrogation. Now, look at where we are. Interrogation? For what, exactly? She was just a 16-year-old girl that lived in Queens, New York. It wasn't as though she had any connection to the Italian mafia, so what did they want with her? Perhaps they grabbed the wrong girl? What do you suggest the demands should be when we talk to Tombstone? There was an underlying quaver in the man's voice, exposing the fear that he felt. It left her puzzled. What exactly did this man have to fear? She was the one tied up while he was in complete control. How was it right that this man got to experience any sort of anxiety when she was left wondering if she would ever see the light of day again? The name Tombstone resounded in her mind like a bell. Who was that, exactly? And why did she, strike such a nerve with these mobster men? If he doesn't want any of this to go public, then I suggest that he forks over millions in cash, the American accent responded, a bit of forced vibrato in his tone of voice. And what about Spider-Man? The breath left her in a whoosh. But it seemed to have gone unnoticed by the group of men. Why were they talking about Peter? More memories flooded back to her. She hadn't been able to get a hold of him before she'd been captured. Was he in danger, too? Did they have him locked up as well, only in a different room? Panic clawed its way up her throat. The very thought of Peter in any sort of predicament such as this sent her nerves aflame. What would they do to him? Would they kill him? Torture him? Tears started to well in her eyes as the mental image of him screaming in agony entered her thoughts, entirely against her will. Was this the reason why she was here? So that they could use her against Peter? Threaten him by stating that they would harm her if he didn't comply with their demands? A derisive snort cut off the building foreboding thoughts swirling in her mind, followed by a snicker coming from another man. What about him? It's been 5 years. No way he's still looking for her. Dread as cold as ice washed over her entire body. Her head pounded in ways that had nothing to do with the injury at the back of her skull. Peter. He wasn't captured. That in itself was a relief. But if it really had been 5 years like these men said, then they were right. Why would he be out there, searching for her? Especially since she left him on a lingering note, unaware if he actually shared her feelings or not. But in the very least she could bank upon their friendship, of that she was certain. Because Peter was too kind-hearted to be totally unaffected by anyone's plight. She had enough confidence that he probably cared about her disappearance in the beginning, when she had first turned up as missing. But as time passed by, he would have given up. Lost hope that she was still alive. And realistically, she couldn't blame him. Because that idea wouldn't have been so unfounded. She was dead for 5 years, made to be nothing but a pile of ash and dust. And if this occurrence happened worldwide as she assumed, then Peter would have correctly surmised that she had been one of the numbers affected by the strange anomaly. It wasn't so far out of the sphere of possibility that Peter had already moved on with his life without her. He probably met a new girl, fell in love, went to college, and was already well on his way to achieving his master's degree in some sort of scientific field of study, all while saving the world in the process. She could easily picture it, his perfect life. Without her. Where she would become an afterthought to him, nothing but a fleeting distant memory. There was echoing laughter from the men as they wandered out of the room and into the hall, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. Unaware that they left her behind with a broken and heavy heart as the tears managed to slip past the cloth of her blindfold. Because no one was coming to save her. She was totally and completely alone. It was another 2 days that passed when the men finally came to check on her once again. Other than that, there had only been a woman who would come in to clean her and take care of the bucket underneath her chair. She had tried to plead with the woman at first to let her go, but she found out pretty quickly that the woman didn't speak a lick of English apart from hello. As soon as she realized, it was pointless to try and converse with her from that moment on. It was clear that she didn't care about Mary Jane's circumstances anyway, otherwise, she wouldn't be complicit in the nefarious scheme. By the time one of the men came back into the room, it was to the point that she was so ravenous and parched that she didn't even bother feigning sleep. The woman never brought her food or water, and it was now to the point where she was desperate enough to beg for it. "Please," she implored, her voice rasping due to how dry her throat felt. It was all that she could think about beyond the painful clenching of her stomach as it squeezed around nothingness. "I'm so thirsty." "Ah," the man said, and immediately Mary Jane knew that he was Italian. There was a pleasant lilt of surprise in his accent when he spoke to her. "You're awake." Teeth gnashing together, Mary Jane couldn't hold back the venom in her tone. She had earned the right to be irritable, especially with them actively starving her. "No shit, Sherlock. TSK, manners." The voice drawled, though it shifted to sounding distinctly amused. As though he saw her merely as a dog with a lot of bark but no bite. "Just for that, perhaps I won't give you food and water." For just a moment, panic shrouded upon her like a large shadow encompassing a garden of sunflowers into darkness. But the feeling didn't last. "If you don't, then I die. And there goes your bargaining chip." With Tombstone. Whoever he was. But he was apparently an important part of the operations here. Enough to spark a healthy dose of fear into the men as they contemplated on how to deal with the man named after a grave. And what's in it for me? She couldn't help but release the exasperated snort. Already, she loathed this man for reasons further than the fact that he aided in kidnapping her. He was on a whole other level of bothersome, he was outright aggravating. "Hate to break it to you, but I don't have anything on me to give you." This was immediately followed up by a dark chuckle on his part. "You're beautiful, yes. But apparently too dumb to think outside of the box." Her blood ran cold. Ice licked at her veins as her eyes widened underneath her blindfold at his blatant indication. There was the sound of a significant footstep that was made in her direction. "No. Wait, stop." She screamed, tears immediately bursting from her eyes. "Get away from me." "Benny." Another voice interjected, fierce, as a new man rushed into the room through the already open door. His Italian voice familiar to her as she had listened to him talk for hours on the phone as he drove her to Venice, drove her to her doom. "Get away from the young girl, you sick fuck." Relief swelled through her like a soothing palm to a painful injury. Despite how this new man had put her in this predicament in the first place, she couldn't help but be grateful to him for his timely interruption. "Aw, come on, Marcus, the sleazeball," Benny mused, his voice had an air of whining complaint to it. She almost expected him to stomp his foot in a tantrum if he didn't get his way in taking advantage of her. Look at her. She's gorgeous and ripe for the taking. She's a child, Marcus interrupted, his voice thunderous with unconcealed rage, and I may run an underground operation here, but I do not condone rape from any of my men. Hearing the word being spoken aloud like that caused her to flinch back. The reality of the situation was just now dawning on her. She almost gotten her virginity stolen away from her by a man that she had never even seen the face of, a man who had helped kidnap and restrain her. Rasping breaths went in and out of her lungs at a rapid rate. Her heart thudded so soundly that she was certain that it was about to burst forth out of her chest. Later, while looking back, she would recognize that she was having a panic attack. But at the moment, all she could think of was what could have been if Marcus had decided to walk into the room not 5 minutes later. Right. You are such a shining beacon of morality. A sour note was intermixed with a sarcastic lilt to Vinny's tone. Get the fuck out of here, Marcus demanded, his voice carrying with the order, you're now barred from guarding her. This news brought with it a great sense of relief. She forced herself to focus on maintaining her breathing, getting deep breaths all the way down through her lungs as she waited until the footsteps disappeared. When a lingering amount of silence followed, and she finally felt in control of her body's reactions and emotions, she addressed the driver who had gotten her in this predicament in the first place. Please. Food. And water? At the very least, he owed her that much. Certo, signorina. My apologies, Marcus said, and his voice actually did sound apologetic. However, she didn't believe it for a second. If he were really sorry, he would let her go. I'll get you some water and fragguno made fresh by my wife. Your wife? Mary Jane couldn't stop herself from musing. A fleeting thought crossed her mind, and she wondered if his wife was a woman that came in periodically to clean Mary Jane's skin. To assess this, she couldn't help but blurt out in an accusatory tone, "Does she know what you did?" There was a lingering pause before the man released a tired sigh. No. She remains as innocent as a flower. I do not involve her in any of this. But enough about my wife, yes? Unless you want to talk about how deliciosa her cooking is. I can see why Vinny wants you, a sudden male voice mused over by the door, startling her out of her fleeting daydreams. Mostly, she found her thoughts drifting to Peter, and her mind would conjure up images where he would find out about her capture and burst into this very room to rescue her before he would confess his undying love for her, like a hero out of a romance novel that her Aunt Anna always liked to read. But in the end, reality would always slap her in the face the longer that she sat tied to this chair. Peter wasn't coming to rescue her. It was unlikely that he even remembered her on a day-to-day basis. Perhaps, every once in a while, her name and face would cross his memories, but that was the most that she could really hope for. The man before her gave a sigh of longing. You are a beautiful American flower. At the words, Mary Jane stiffened. It had been a few days since she had heard any male voice in her proximity. To hear one now was startling enough to her senses, but the words were in an entirely concerning sphere on its own. Do not worry yourself, signorina. I will not touch you. She wasn't entirely sure that she believed him, but what was there that she could do to the contrary? He cleared his throat then, nervously, as he added, You unless you want it of me? I don't. Mary Jane just managed to get out through clenched teeth. Her voice immediate and curt. A regretful sigh left him and she could hear his body slump as it leaned heavily against the door, supporting his body's weight. I understand. But I still thought I would test my luck. The urge to throw her head back and scream skyward was almost overwhelming, but she managed to resist. She was nothing more than a slab of meat to these men. In their eyes, she was far from a human being and more of an object that they wanted to fondle and toy with until there was nothing left of herself inside. Never before had she ever felt so disgusted. But there was also an undertone of shame that she was desperately trying not to feel. Their words were certainly doing their best to affect her psychologically, and there were times, when her mind took a particular turn for the bleak and hopeless, when it got to her. And she felt dirty. Impure. Unworthy. But she has had years of dealing with thoughts such as these. She had to when she had parents like her own. There were many times where they both made her feel worthless. When her dad had been drinking all day and would turn his ire on her, complaining about how expensive she was, or if he hadn't had to worry about taking care of her financially, then maybe he wouldn't have gambled away all of their savings. While her mom, She had once outright told Mary Jane to her face that she wished that she never had her. Because then she wouldn't feel the need to be tied to her father anymore. When faced with years of comments just like that, Mary Jane had found a way to cope. Like a mantra, she would recite in her mind that she had all the confidence in the world. Nothing could tear her down. Because she was strong, independent, and she could overcome anything. It was almost too simple for her to adopt the same tactic with this current scenario. Taking in a deep breath, Mary Jane forced herself to remain calm. When she released it, she finally felt that she was steady enough to address the man. "Why are you keeping me here? If you just let me go, I promise that I won't say anything to anyone." Alas, Fiore, that cannot be allowed. We are in the middle of negotiations with Tombstone for our silence. His voice sounded tired, regretful. It was a sign that negotiations were not going in their favor. What that meant for her, she had no clue. Would it be a good thing if they didn't get what they wanted from Tombstone? Or was she rooting for the negotiations to be over so that they would finally set her free? "He is demanding that we carry out his original request." Which is? She couldn't help but ask, wanting to be prepared for what any of this could mean for her future fate. The identity of the Spider-Man, of course. Mary Jane couldn't help but stiffen. The world tilted on its axis. Her head spun in what felt like a whir of dizzying angles as nausea threatened to claw up her throat. Peter? They wanted to expose Peter? Dread washed over her like a cold, unforgiving shower. That first day. They had mentioned that this was meant to be a simple kidnapping and interrogation. Somehow, these people had found out her connection with Spider-Man. And they sought to torture the information of his identity out of her. She couldn't help but think that all of this was her fault. She strained her memory, trying to think back to a time when she perhaps had been careless, let loose that she had known Spider-Man on an intimate level. "You know him, yes?" She took a second too long to answer, unable to find her voice until the moment delayed itself too much. "No. I've only met him once." She forced her voice to be kept light and appropriately confused. She could only hope that it was convincing enough. "When he saved the charity ball that I had been attending from a bomb." "That sounds like a lie, Fiore. But no matter. It doesn't concern us until we come to an agreement with Tombstone. Only then will we begin the interrogation." They could torture her all that they wanted. They could burn her, whip her, or tear her hair out. No matter what they did, she refused to give up Peter's name. Because even if he had forgotten all about her, her feelings were still very real, raw, and deep. She would die before she betrayed him like that. Jutting her chin upward, Mary Jane forced a sense of vibrato. Who is Tombstone? His name had been thrown around a few times now, and she still had yet to get a real grasp on who he really was. She desperately wanted to know, just so that she knew exactly what it was that she was up against here. Someone that you really shouldn't have gotten involved with, Fiore. Days passed with her sitting, endlessly sitting, tied to that chair. The ropes around her wrists and ankles had chafed the skin there raw. Without the ability to even look at the sites of injury, she could tell that there was ever-present blood and bruising around the areas. Her muscles ached from, not only lack of use, but from sitting in the same upward position for weeks on end. It was long past the point where her limbs had simply fallen asleep. The pain was so bad that she couldn't even fall into the escape of blissful sleep. When Marcus finally returned to her, she begged for an opportunity to change her current predicament. "Please," she sobbed, her pride long gone in light of the unbearable pain that coursed through her every nerve. "Everything hurts. Please just let me go." There was a sharp intake of breath that came from Marcus as he observed her. She hoped with all of her heart that he would take pity on her, finally. "It hurts my heart to see you this way, Signorina. I have a daughter not much younger than you." Mary Jane latched onto this new information, like a moth to a flame. "And how would you feel? Seeing her being treated the way that I currently am?" He let loose an exhausted sigh and took his time before he answered. And when he did, the voice that accompanied it sounded weak and rather ill. "I would weep like I was mourning the deaths of 1,000 loved ones." Tears leaked out of her eyes, completely unable to get a firm grasp on who exactly this man was. "Then why are you doing this?" "It was never meant to become this extreme, you see. With a blip, everything changed. And I've got a family that I've got to provide for." "Then why doesn't he just get a normal job like the rest of the world? Surely there were better occupations that paid well and also sat well with his conscience? Or Perhaps he didn't actually have a conscience at all and was merely toying with her emotions, breaking her down psychologically bit by bit. But Mary Jane bit her tongue to keep her thoughts to herself. If you never meant to get it this far, then please. If you can't let me go, then at least untie me. Let me sleep on a bed, or even just a pad, she broke off with a sob. My bones and muscles are aching. And the ropes, they're cutting into my skin. It was silent for a long moment, as Mary Jane awaited to see if the man would finally reveal his true nature. Would he prove himself to be a real villain with nefarious intentions? Or would he merely be a hypocrite, doing dirty deeds while feigning righteousness? She hoped for the latter, then at least in that case, he may actually provide her with her request. She waited for his answer for what felt like ages, but in actuality, it was likely only a few minutes. I'll see what I can do, Signorina, he finally said, followed by another lingering pause. For what it is worth, I am deeply sorry that this has happened to you. Her lips thinned, but she didn't give any sort of response. His apology meant nothing, because he was the reason for her being here in the first place. And beyond that, he still refused to rectify and atone for it by letting her go. It was several hours later when the door opened once again. Footsteps walked past her to the opposite wall, where something light was dropped onto the hard cement floor. Then, like it was some sort of miracle, the footsteps returned to her and a knife cut at the ropes that bound her. She sat, frozen, unsure of what to do or if she could even move. I have brought you the pad that you requested, Signorina. Marcus' voice from over by the door announced jovially, as though he were giving her the most precious gift. By the sounds of it, he was expecting her gratitude of praise. She began. Silent tears started flowing down her cheeks from underneath the blindfold. Her limbs weren't conforming to the commands from her mind. I don't think that I can move. Marcus' voice dropped to a much somber tone. I see. Vinny, can you please carry her to the pad? The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. She gasped and her body twitched, its natural reaction to flee, but she was still unable to move her legs. And no. Mary Jane protested, her voice weak. Do not fret, Signorina, Marcus said as the hands that had cut her free were now maneuvering her so that they supported the back of her knees and torso before lifting her against her will. She didn't want this bastard touching her. But Marcus seemed to be fully unaware of the true extent of her distress. Vinny explained to me that everything he said before was all in jest. He was trying to keep you too scared to put up a fight. But as more distance was put between them and Marcus as they made their way over to the pad on the far wall, Vinny put his mouth to Mary Jane's ear and breathed out a message that only she was able to hear. You got us a bed. How very thoughtful of you. Mary Jane stiffened as she was set down on the pad. For the first time in weeks, her limbs were lying straight. Mercifully, Vinny stood upright and walked away from her. But with every step of distance that he put between them, it should have made her feel safer, but it didn't. His words lingered and bounced around in her brain, echoing its concealed threat. That sooner or later, he would find a way to come to her. To violate her. Paolo will stand guard. I've got another meeting with Hammerhead, Marcus said, a smile in his voice again, entirely proud of himself for fulfilling her one request besides food, water and releasing her out to the world. I hope you enjoy your rest, Signorina. The door thudded shut, shrouding her in darkness as her shaky hand came up and tore off the blindfold, allowing her eyes a semblance of freedom for the first time in weeks. She waited in fear as a couple of days passed, drifting in and out of restless sleep all throughout. Every noise, every creak that she heard, would jolt her awake, fear plaguing her that Vinny had somehow found a way to sneak into her captivity. This left her with no other choice. Now that she was out of her binds, she had the first real chance at escape. The only issue was the stiff immobility of her limbs from being tied up for far too long. Time worked slowly on regaining her strength as she continued to lay flat on her back. To pass the time, she allowed herself to study the room, her eyes long since acclimated themselves to the darkness. The only opening to the room was the door that was constantly guarded by one of Marcus' men. Soon enough, Marcus would entrust Vinny to do the job again, and Mary Jane shuddered, her eyes taking a desperate rake over the rest of the room. And there, near the ceiling, a vent, the covering plastered with a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. Mary Jane swallowed thickly as she looked at the webbing, unwillingly reminded of the boy who had given up on finding her. Shifting her thoughts, Mary Jane couldn't help but wonder how Marcus had missed the vent when they decided to cut her free of the ropes. But then, taking inventory of the opening, they probably thought it was too small for a person to fit through. And perhaps, at the beginning of her capture, it would be. But they haven't been feeding her nearly enough. She had a good feeling that she would be able to squeeze through the small opening to get into the more spacious air ducts beyond. And she would use that dreaded chair as a way for her to reach it. She waited until she knew that it was nightfall to finally strike. For the first time in weeks, she made use of her legs on her own. Managing to crawl onto her knees, Mary Jane plastered her hand onto the wall to help support her weight as she lifted herself onto shaky feet. For a beat of time, vertigo swelled over her as she stood for the first time in over 5 years. The dizziness made her nearly nauseous enough to want to bend over and hurl. But she waited a minute, breathing in deeply through her nose and out of her mouth as the sensation started to dissipate. Once it did, Mary Jane squared her shoulders and set her sights on the chair that they had foolishly left behind. She had once thought that her most important walk would have been when she walked the runway for the first time. But this seemed so much more monumental. It was simple, she told herself. All she had to do was put one foot in front of the other, shifting her body's weight between the two limbs as she did so. Inhaling a deep breath, she readied herself for the walk of a lifetime. Because she was Mary Jane Watson, and she had all the confidence in the world. Straightening her stance, Mary Jane trudged forward and took the first step. And then another. Marveling at the fact that she hadn't yet fallen over. She was doing it. Several wobbly steps later, her hands finally made purchase on the wooden back of the chair. Her hands squeezed it tight. As much as she hated this chair, it would now aid in her salvation. With strength that she didn't know that she still possessed, Mary Jane lifted the legs of the chair a couple of inches from the ground. There was no possibility of her dragging it against the hard floor, they would only hear the scrape of it. With each painstaking step that she took, Mary Jane gritted her teeth as she exerted with the effort. Adrenaline must have been pumping through her veins, otherwise, the weakness that she felt would have surely overcome her by now. It felt like a lifetime before she made it to the wall just underneath the vent, but she refrained a sigh of relief, not wanting to risk the noise. In the grand scheme of things, moving the chair had been the easy part. With deliberate care, Mary Jane set down the chair onto the floor with the gentlest of thuds indicating that it made purchase. Ensuring its steadiness, Mary Jane then endured the harrowing task of lifting her legs onto the platform of the chair. Then elevating her arms over her head, she began the process of trying to figure out how to remove the vent cover without any sort of tools. Peering as closely as she could tell that the vent cover was being held up by 2 measly screws. Bringing one hand down, she did a quick inspection of her fingernails and was relieved to see that they were unbroken. They would have to be enough for her to use as a makeshift screwdriver. It was a taxing process. But once she managed to get the actual screw loose enough, she was able to untwist it with her fingers the rest of the way. When she undid the second and final screw, the vent cover very nearly fell to the floor in a clatter, and it would have if she hadn't managed to catch it first. For a minute, she clutched the cover tight to her chest, waiting for one of the men to burst in on her mid-escape attempt. When nothing happened, the thundering pace of her heart slowed fractionally as she took the time to step down from the chair and gently place the vent cover onto the floor. Taking a deep breath, Mary Jane took a second to hype herself up for the most difficult part of what happened next. Stepping onto the seat of the furniture again, she hoisted herself up before she looked up at the small opening that she was meant to squeeze through. It was rather daunting. It seemed so high. Huffing out a deep breath, she decided that there was no reason to dally. Staying wouldn't change her circumstances. She had to do this. The brutal strain of lifting her arms while her hands latched at the small opening near the ceiling caused her whole body to ache. But she pushed through exertion, latching her feet on the grooves between the cinder blocks on the wall in order to crawl her way up it. It was another irony. Her climbing walls. Just like Spider-Man. There was a fleeting thought in the back of her mind that wondered what it was that he would say if he saw her now. He had once tried to give her tips in rock climbing, though what he said then was all in jest. See? It's all about the stickiness of your fingers. She tried to climb the wall as quickly as she could, not wanting to give her arms the time to give out under holding the weight of her body. Gritting her teeth, she pulled her form up just enough to get her elbows latched along the edges of the tiny gap. Peering forward, she was relieved to see that she had surmised correctly when she assumed that the air ducts would be larger than the actual vent outlet. With her elbows now locked in around the edges of the hole, it was easier for her to scramble the rest of her frame upward with the smallest of grunts. Once she had the majority of her body inside of the air ducts, with only her feet dangling out, she allowed her body to collapse for just a moment, needing to catch her breath before she could proceed. The metal was cool against her cheek, which felt nice, as her whole body burned with laborious throbs. But she couldn't remain. Freedom was now on the very tip of her tongue. She could taste the ghost of it, and it promised to be delicious. Forcing herself up onto her shaky hands and knees, she began her potentially perilous expedition. She crawled as slowly and quietly as she could for a bit of time. Eventually, she passed by another vent cover. She peered out through the cracks of it, surveying the room. It looked to be a room designated for the building's garbage, as the room was full of large bins filled with trash bags. Someone was obviously neglecting their duties of disposal because they were overflowing. Kinda like how they neglected their duty of giving her regular meals. She decided to move on. But crawling for another minute more, she hit a roadblock. Up ahead, there was a large whirring fan, looking so very metal and sharp as it spun at high speed. There was no way that she would be able to get past it. There was no other option then. She had to go back to that trash room. She had hoped that she would be able to find a way out nearer to the outside, for easier access to freedom, but it seemed that she had no other choice. Unable to turn around in the limited amount of space, she had to slide herself backward down the chute to get back to the only outlet for escape. Soon enough, she was back above the room containing the large trash bins. Somehow, she would have to try and figure out some way to get the cover off of the vent from the inside. Examining closely, she saw that this vent was similar to the last one, being held up by two tiny screws from the other side. Taking a moment to just breathe, she crawled forward slightly again and then turned onto her back, craning her neck upward so that she could see her actions clearly. Then, rearing her foot back, she kicked, hard. A loud bang came from it and Mary Jane cringed, but she continued to persist. It only took a total of 7 kicks for the flimsy screws to finally give way to the impact. The vent cover shot forward and fell toward the ground inside of the room. She held her breath, waiting for the inevitable clang of it hitting against the hard floor, but it never came. Puzzled, Mary Jane scooted back so that her face was in front of the now unbarred opening and saw with relief that the vent cover had fallen into the overflowing trash bin below. And Mary Jane, she was going to do the same. Sliding forward again, she positioned herself so that her feet were dangling outside of the small outlet. Cascading her body further out of the vent, Mary Jane propelled herself forward to the point where gravity took over and she was falling. She clamped her teeth down tight to keep from making any noise as she made impact against the full bags of trash. There were some hard items within the bin that had caused a scratch or two on her limbs, as well as the beginning of multiple bruises, but she was otherwise unharmed. Biting her lip, Mary Jane hoisted herself up, despite every protest that came from her body, and scrambled her way across the top of trash in the most ungraceful manner possible. When she got to the edge, she raised her leg over it and slid it down as close to the ground as possible, her foot unable to touch the floor quite yet, before her other leg followed over the edge. Before she knew it, both feet were on solid ground, and the tiniest laugh of disbelief escaped from her chest at her success as tears watered in her eyes. She did it. She was finally out of that room. But she refrained from celebrating prematurely as she was far from out of the woods yet. She still had to navigate the building to the nearest exit, all while lurking under the radar so that she would avoid getting caught. If she was detected, she was in no condition to fight. Her only hope at the point would be to run, which seemed like an impossibility when she only just regained the ability to walk again. Her only hope was that it wouldn't get to that point. There was only one exit from the room, 2 swinging double doors that thankfully looked like it lacked a lock. With her feet more steady the longer that she used them, she sidled up against one of the doors and slowly pushed it open in order for her to peek out into the hall beyond. The coast was clear, but there was still the issue of which direction it was that she should take. Taking a risk and poking her head out further, she whipped her attention back and forth, trying to decide. All that she knew was that if she went left, it would be backtracking in the same direction that her previous captivity had been in, which she knew for certain was guarded constantly by one person at least. Right it is, she muttered under her breath as she slipped through the small opening that the swinging door created and stealthily made her way right and down the hall. She found herself clinging to the wall, as though it would somehow protect her if she happened to be discovered by someone walking down the opposite end of the hall. It helped that it also supported her uneasy footsteps. She wandered about for a measurable amount of time. The entire stretch of it left her in a state suppressing her bated breath. It was almost too quiet within the halls. An eerie, unsettling feeling accompanied this observation. How was it possible that she hasn't yet run into anyone? Turning another corner, salvation suddenly found her, a set of heavy metal doors with a sign above it that read Asita. She saw that exact sign enough times upon her arrival in the Italian airport that she knew that it meant exit. Choking back a sob of relief, Mary Jane made a beeline for it. She was halfway there when, "Hey!" a masculine voice yelled from behind her. And without even sparing a moment to think, Mary Jane ran. She ran like her body wasn't screaming at her in absolute agony, because right then, she could barely feel the pain. She ran like her very life depended on it, because it did. The pounding of 2 pairs of footsteps resounded behind her, the sound of it rivaling the erratic beat of her heart. "For mercy!" One of them cried at her back just as she made it to the doors. She pushed them open with all of her might, stepping out into the fresh night air for the first time. She kept sprinting as her mind tried to take inventory of her surroundings outside. She was at a warehouse building off of a shipping port of sorts. If she could just make it to any sort of residential area, she would be able to cry for help where, hopefully, someone would be able to aid her. They could hide her away and call the police. And she could call Aunt Anna, to let her know that she was safe and needed help getting passage home. Home. The warm thought of it so close, she could almost feel it within her grasp. All of these thoughts helped to push the adrenaline through her veins as she neared the edge of the warehouse building that had held her captive. Rounding the corner, she was halted right in her steps when large, beefy hands grabbed at her shoulders. Looking up in horror, she saw that she ran right into a man who had been leaning against the outside wall, smoking a cigar. Only this man looked to be more alien than human, with a large, protruding forehead and a head that was flat on the top, accompanied with it was black hair and a big scowl pointed in her direction. Well, look what we've got here." His voice came out like an animalistic growl, it was so deep. Mary Jane struggled and thrashed desperately against his hold. "No, please. Let me." The footsteps that had been in hot pursuit of her rounded the corner. "Hammerhead." The man didn't respond to what she could only assume was an insult directed his way. Instead, he gritted his teeth as he shot the pair of them a look of heated disapproval. And before anything else could even be said, the man started dragging her back to the doors that she had just escaped from. Mary Jane struggled against his hold with all of her might, all the while as she screamed, where little time passed before the large metal doors enclosed her within her prison once again. The Stark satellites were unique in the sense that they ran solely on an arc reactor, while competing satellites relied on solar power from the sun. This meant that the Stark satellites were the most powerful and reliable of the bunch that hurtled throughout orbit, at least according to Times magazine. And it proved this theory right when a teenage girl ran outside of a building in Venice, Italy for only 2 minutes and the Stark satellite caught onto the scene in 32 seconds flat. And as soon as it did, a part of the spacecraft came to life as codes burst forth within the software system. Facial recognition of Mary Jane Watson, a match. Transmitting data to EDITH, initiating transfer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Download to EDITH complete. Alerting Peter Parker of new data now. Awaiting further instruction. AN, what do you think? Will the bad guys realize that they done gone fucked up when Spider-Man comes bursting through the door full of vengeance? Also, in a very significant way, Mary Jane saved herself. It was her escape attempt that allowed for EDITH to finally get a read on her when she managed to step outside. Otherwise, it may have taken too long to find her, much to Mary Jane's detriment. Let me know your thoughts. Next chapter promises to be a big one. Unless I somehow find a way to drag this out longer because I'm evil like that, devilish face. Please leave me a comment below. I know that I beg for them at every chapter, but they really do motivate me to write faster. Thanks so much for reading.